Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Khosrau and Anushirawan Part 5 on Top of the World by Extra History. So, last time we saw Khosrau's repeated victories against Justinian, but we ended with the emergence of the plague, which will devastate both the Persians and the Romans. This is the final episode in our series on Khosrau. I've had a good time learning about him. I hope you guys have too. If you have, I would appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon and channel memberships, both of which you can find below, and through both of which you can access exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Khosrau had been at the top of the world. Now he lay tossing and turning on a bed far from his royal palace.
Yeah, so last time, as I mentioned, we saw the emergence of the plague, and even Khosrau was infected at one point. I suspect he'll survive, but this was an extremely deadly and devastating plague. Even if Khosrau does survive, I imagine his empire is going to take a lot of damage. I know a bit more about the Eastern Roman Empire, and it was completely devastated by this plague. Justinian ended up all right, but his empire began to really crumble. A lot of his achievements were eaten away at by the plague. His conquests were decimated. So I've talked about how I'm a little mixed on Justinian. I think he was too ambitious for his own good. There were a lot of consequences for the actions he took that would only emerge after he was already dead. But I think a lot of those consequences were also due to how destructive the plague was. I'm curious to see its impact on the Sassanids.
Surrounded by an army that couldn't even stand, much less raise a sword. And as word of Khosrau's illness traveled home, it reached the ears of his son, Anushirwan.
Uh-oh, I don't like how they're framing that. Do we have a son who's going to try and seize power from his father, or are there other considerations at play? I don't know. I guess we'll see.
Anushirwan had been locked in prison. Not the Fortress of Oblivion. There were too many Kavad-shaped holes in that particular jail.
Yeah, the impressively named Fortress of Oblivion, as we saw, was not very good at holding anyone prisoner. Its walls were quite permeable, actually.
No, a different prison just outside Ctesiphon. The young man had been caught getting busy with some of Khosrau's wives, and was locked away as punishment.
That's a little weird, no?
Well, briefly. It turns out that jailbreaking skills ran in the family. Just like the Mazdakites had flocked to Kawus a decade prior, Christians in Khosrau's court began flocking to his Christian son on.
Interesting. So, as we saw, the Mazdakites were this sort of proto-communist type religion. They had been a big problem for Kavad, Khosrau's father, and Khosrau had brought an end to that problem rather violently. And now we have Christians flocking to Khosrau's Christian son. It's interesting because this dissent comes in the form of religion, but I imagine that these religious movements also attracted broader dissent. You know, those who were unhappy with the current status quo, whether they were Christian or not. But, of course, there are, at this point, a lot of Christians in this region. We saw that Christians, are around. There's a lot of different people in this region of a lot of different religions. So it's an interesting mix. I'm curious to see if this goes anywhere.
Anushirwan. But here, Khosrau's reform efforts came to his rescue. Even though the army he'd led against Rome was now devastated by plague, he still had plenty of loyal soldiers serving back home. When one of them brought word of Anushirwan's rebellion, Khosrau sent the man back with two objectives: kill the Christians and capture my son. The fight was bloody. Khosrau's generals quickly overpowered Anushirwan, who had little military experience, but the young man refused to be captured.
See, this is the thing. He doesn't want them to kill his son for many reasons. It's bad for the line. He would rather his son be brought back in line and that he be able to pass down his power to his son once he is gone. But, that sort of relies on some level of compliance from Khosrau's son. There also might be some personal feelings at play. I don't know how close they were, but He probably didn't want to murder his son for, like I said, a multitude of reasons. But as we've seen throughout his life, Khosrau has had to contend with a number of family members who have challenged his power. This was really not unusual for this time period or this sort of situation. I think of the Eastern Roman Empire. We have a lot of dynastic chaos and drama in the Roman Empire. You know, cousins trying to take the throne, your brother betraying you, leading a rebellion, sons taking over from fathers, all that kind of stuff. And this is just what happens when you have this sort of system.
He died fighting alongside his followers, who were quickly rounded up and put to the sword. Khosrau
Well, there's the end to that.
prided himself on his open-mindedness, and once boasted that he had not rejected anyone for belonging to a different religion or people.
I mean, that is true based on what we've seen so far, or at least how extra history has presented it to us. He certainly was a proud Zoroastrian. That was his religion, and he did a lot of work to revitalize Zoroastrianism, but we saw that he was even taking in religious refugees from the Roman Empire, who at this point was very Christian, and they were not really fond of other religions, particularly those pagans, even though, of course, Roman and Greek history is, up until a certain point, a history of pagans. And so a lot of pagan philosophers and intellectuals had fled to the Sassanid Empire because Khosrau was relatively more tolerant. I'm not sure if there's going to be a but on the end of that. He was tolerant, but I guess we're about to see.
But while he continued to defend
There's the but.
Christianity's right to exist within his empire, he began to view certain Christians as political threats. Those who had supported Anushirawan seemed to demand a ruler who shared their faith. And
Interesting. I mean, we saw sort of a similar thing with the Mazdakites. Khosrau's father, Kavad, initially was in alliance with the Mazdakites, but they got too powerful, they were disrupting him, and they became a problem. We're seeing a similar thing here. Khosrau doesn't have an issue with Christians within his empire, but now he feels, and I'm not sure how warranted this feeling is, seems like there might be some legitimacy to it, he feels that now the Christians are becoming a threat to his power base, and he probably feels like he has to do something about that.
already Khosrau had seen 2 territories on his western border try to leave his empire to join Christian Rome. The political power of Christianity threatened to overwhelm Iran, and Khosrau had to stop it. Plague had forced him to make
We have old Khosrau now.
peace with Justinian, but that very peace allowed him to turn his attention toward Justinian's allies. Christians from Ethiopia had crossed over into Yemen decades before, and during the war,
And as we saw when we were reacting to Extra History series on Ethiopia, which was a member/patron-only series, Ethiopia, if we look back on the history of Christianity, it really is one of the oldest Christian states that has survived for a very long period of time. I mean, one of the oldest, I don't mean like, the oldest, but it's amongst some of the oldest, right? Of course, Christianity, we're talking about emerging in the Levant, Judea, Jesus, all his followers. Ethiopia isn't that far away. So really, before Christianity spread to many places where it is very popular today, Ethiopia was already pretty Christian.
Justinian had tried to convince them to attack Iran across the Persian Gulf. They would have done it too if they didn't have so many of their own civil war issues to deal with. Khosrau seized this opportunity. He marched his army into Yemen, pushed back the Ethiopians, and installed a loyal Arabic king.
Wow.
In a single move, he not only managed to push Justinian's allies out of the region and replace them with his own, but he also locked down the last sea route to India.
We're also seeing how religion can be used in a political sense here. This will certainly become more important as the years go on, as, the Byzantine Empire's culture, its particularly Orthodox Christian culture, will spread throughout the region. Now, Ethiopia, a very early Christian state, but if we look at, say, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, we have a lot of examples of states, kingdoms, or tribes in that region that would convert, or their leader would convert to Orthodox Christianity in order to cement some sort of alliance with the Byzantines, or in order to lay some claim to that Byzantine Orthodox legitimacy. So we're already sort of seeing Christianity being used as a political measure, and as it becomes more prominent, it's already very prominent at this point, and more powerful, particularly in a European context, we will see that sort of thing more and more. Of course, in a Middle Eastern context, in not that long, we will see the emergence of Islam, and Islam will spread very rapidly through the entire Middle East, which sort of cuts Christianity off. So, it shifts more towards a European context.
Now, both Rome and Africa would have to go through his ports and pay his taxes if they wanted luxury spices, silks, and teas from the east. Unfortunately, Khosrau's control of the eastern trade soon put him at odds with his own allies. You remember those Hephthalites who killed Khosrau's grandfather? Kavad had eventually sought revenge for that offense by waging several wars against them, after using their help and technology to secure his own throne, of course.
Yes, the Hephthalites were formidable foes for a while, though we have not seen them for a couple of episodes at this point.
But, as always, it fell to Khosrau to finish the job. He teamed up with the Northern Turks to attack the Hephthalites from multiple directions, and together they wiped the Hephthalite Empire off the face of the earth.
Wow.
Khosrau took a chunk out.
That's a pretty remarkable achievement, given, as was just mentioned earlier in this series, we saw the Sassanids face a series of pretty terrible defeats against the Hephthalites. And the Hephthalites played a seemingly pretty big role in Sassanid politics. Khosrau, with the help of some allies, has completely wiped them off the map.
Out of their old southern territory, and left the rest to the Turks so they could form their own new kingdom in the north. The Turks settled right in and started trading with merchants from the Silk Road. They wanted to follow Iran's lead and sell their new luxury goods to the Romans at a huge markup. But to get to Rome, they would have to go through Iran. They naturally assumed that their old ally Khosrau would be cool about this and give them a lower tax rate. But Khosrau did not.
And we just saw how Khosrau really wants to monopolize this trade from the east, whether it be by sea or by land. And we saw earlier in the series how Khosrau sort of contributed to building a lot of infrastructure, a lot of roads that would extend the Silk Road further west. He would be the arbiter, the middleman of all these goods coming from the east, China, India, flowing through Iran to the Roman Empire, and then, throughout the rest of Europe or wherever else they would end up. So, Khosrau definitely wants to sort of monopolize this trade. He wants everything to go through him. So I'm not sure if he's willing to compromise on this.
To be cool. He had just secured the last few silk trade routes for his empire. Why would he want to give up that monopoly? So he sent the Turks away empty-handed. And naturally, they were furious. But the Turks had learned a few tricks during their time allied with Khosrau. They sent a message to Rome, proposing that the two of them team up to...
Yeah, if you're a small to mid-sized tribe, kingdom, or people around this area, and by this area, I really mean anywhere close to the Romans or the Persians, if you're smart, that your best chance to defeat or at least gain an advantage over one is to write a letter to the other. We saw this when Justinian was fighting with the Visigoths in Italy. They sent envoys to Khosrau saying, hey, why don't you attack the Romans? This is a great opportunity for you, and it helps us. And Khosrau obliged. Now, these Turks are trying exactly the same thing. Just as the Visigoths were on the other side of the Roman Empire, these Turks are on the other side of the Sassanid Empire, and they're communicating with the Romans saying, hey, if you help attack Khosrau and the Sassanids, that would be good for you, and it would be an opportunity for us.
Form a pincer around Iran, exactly like Khosrau had urged them to do to the Hephthalites. Now, Justinian had passed away at this point and left the throne to his nephew, Justin II.
Okay, we're on to Justin II. We did not cover the death of Justinian in this one, which is fine. It's a series on Khosrau. Though they do have a series on Justinian that I may react to. I think I mentioned that last time as well. Let me know if you're interested.
And Rome wasn't doing so hot. All of
Yeah.
the looming problems of Justinian's grand and ambitious reign had collapsed onto.
And this is exactly what I've talked about several times over now. I try not to hammer on the same point over and over. Well, that's not really true. I don't try to not to do that. I do that all the time. But as I've said, I really think Justinian was overly ambitious, and there were a lot of problems that, with great intelligence and skill, he managed to hold off during his reign. I certainly think Justinian was a very impressive man, but those problems didn't disappear, they didn't vanish. When Justinian was gone, they all came crashing down. Part of that was out of his control, a big part of that was the plague. I think a part of it was the actions of Justinian himself. That's where the real debate is. How responsible was Justinian for all of these problems that would quickly emerge after he was gone? I don't know. There's an argument to be made either way, right? But this is exactly what happened once he was gone.
To his nephew. The treasury was empty, the army was stretched thin, and Justin was just not the same savvy operator his uncle had been. Justin resented.
Well, this is the issue with having this sort of dynastic system. Or, it really is the issue with having any system where you have one guy at the top and then another one gets put in sometime later, whether through an election, a president, a prime minister, or a king. Though it's certainly worse with the king because there is zero guarantee that the guy who comes after will be anywhere near as talented as the guy who comes before. Now, that may also be true for a system like a presidency, but whatever, we're talking about a dynastic system here. You have Justinian, talented, intelligent, capable, and then Justin II, there's just no way he can live up to that. In fact, almost no one can live up to what Justinian did. And so, inevitably, he's not going to be able to handle all of these issues that Justinian has been putting off.
The annual tribute that Justinian had agreed to pay Iran for guarding the Caucasian gates. And destroying Iran seemed like the best solution. Which maybe it would have been if he'd had a competent army, or money, or any advantage at all, really. The one advantage he'd expected to have didn't materialize. The Turks never got their army together to support Rome's attack. But Justin wanted this war now, and Khosrau's growing distrust of the Christians in his empire soon provoked it. In an effort to prevent any more of his border territories from switching sides, Khosrau sent an administrator to the Christian province of Greater Armenia with orders to strengthen Zoroastrian worship there. Despite the objections of the Armenians, who had long ago been promised religious freedom, Khosrau's official built a new Zoroastrian fire temple.
Oh, interesting. So, once again, now we're playing politics using religion. I would say both empires are not really ready for this war. Both are certainly weakened from the recent events, aka the plague, but both are barreling towards this conflict. And what they're fighting over is the Caucasus, right? And remarkably, a lot of countries we see on the map there are still around today. Armenia is an ancient kingdom. There's still Armenia on our modern map of the world, though there wasn't for a while. Iberia, I know it might be confusing because Iberia is also what we call, Spain and Portugal. But in this context, Iberia is Georgia. That's what we call it today. So I honestly find it pretty remarkable when I see a map of this long ago, the ancient world. Though we're moving out of the ancient world into the early medieval period. But you see a map like this and you say, hey, that is still there today. Of course, that is a long period of time. These countries have come in and out of existence in many different forms, but it's still pretty cool.
The Armenians reached out to Justin, asking if he would support them switching sides. And of course he would. So they launched their war in the most dramatic way possible. The Armenians killed Khosrau's official, and Justin immediately halted his tribute to Iran.
Wow.
Khosrau cracked his knuckles at this and replied, "All right, kiddo. Let me show you why your uncle learned never to mess with me."
Yeah, I was gonna say, hey, Khosrau's done this before, and he did it to Justinian. I guess we'll see how it goes this time, but I'm a little scared for Justin.
Once again, the armies of Iran swept into eastern Rome. Khosrau relished this chance to finish what he'd started 30 years ago, and despite being 70 years old now, he led the armies himself.
Wow.
They swept up towns along the border, while Justin's troops languished in a siege in an Armenian city not far from Dara. Furious that his army had accomplished so little while Iran had conquered so much, Justin abruptly fired his general and left his troops in a panic.
Oh man, I mean, look, we saw how much Justinian struggled against the Sassanid incursion, even though he was Justinian, and he had Belisarius, though Belisarius was occupied for a lot of this campaign. What chance does Justin II stand? I'm not sure how talented or great his generals were, but I'd be willing to bet that none of them measured up to Belisarius.
They abandoned the siege and fled, leaving their weapons and equipment behind.
Damn.
Khosrau sauntered over to the abandoned war camp, picked up those weapons with a thank you very much, and set off to conquer Dara. It had been 72
Wow.
years since the Romans built that fort in violation of the treaty they once had with Iran.
See, remember we talked about Dara much earlier on, and I believe, I might be wrong on this, but I believe when we first talked about it, I said something like, hey, keep an eye on Dara, it's going to be important. And it has been important throughout this entire series. Not that this is some secret little bit of trivia, but Dara, particularly in this period, is a very important frontier fort between Persia and Rome. And we've seen that importance several times over.
And to Khosrau, that meant that it was well past time that Dara fell. He spared no expense. He diverted an entire river and cut all of the aqueducts to break the city's water supply. Then he carved rocks from the mountains themselves to build ramparts that would let his troops storm over the wall.
Wow.
Dara, that monument to Roman treachery and stubborn defiance, finally fell. When Justin heard about this loss, it broke him.
Yeah, that'd be pretty upsetting. It seems like this is the end of Dara. Maybe some of you know. Would it pop back up again? Would it be important in the future? I don't know. I just know that for this time period, in terms of conflict between the Persians and the Romans, it was this very important frontier outpost. I don't know if this is the end of it for all time, but it seems like Khosrau really did a number on it.
He descended into madness, literally snapping at the attendants who tried to nurse him back to health. During a rare moment of lucidity, Justin's wife, Sophia, convinced him to appoint his general Tiberius as co-emperor. She also negotiated a short truce with Khosrau and bought Rome time to stabilize. In return, Khosrau...
Shout out Sophia. I've heard this before. Like I said, I know a little bit about this period. Yeah, Justin II seems to have lost his mind. And I've heard the story of, in a brief moment of lucidity, he managed to give his wife some authority and make these decisions, like appointing a co-emperor. But yeah, he really sort of went off the deep end. But Sophia's trying to clean things up.
got to have free reign in Armenia, which the truce now left unprotected. He quickly moved his army over there and began sacking cities, while Tiberius struggled to put his army back together. It took 5 years, but he did it. He was finally ready to take on Khosrau. The old Shah was so preoccupied leading his troops over in Armenia that this newly rejuvenated Roman force caught him by surprise. They circled his camp at night and forced him to flee, abandoning his pavilion and all of the riches he'd gathered. His retreat path led across a river, but while Khosrau crossed safely on the back of an elephant, many of his troops were swept away. Only by wreaking havoc and setting fire to the towns on the other side of the river did he manage to throw off the Roman pursuit and escape to the safety of Iranian land. The shame of this defeat compelled Khosrau to pass a new law, forbidding future shahs from leading armies into battle. He returned to Ctesiphon and let his...
I guess that is kind of an embarrassing scene, getting caught like that by the Romans when you were ravaging this land so successfully. But, I mean, you can kind of see how he got ahead of himself. He's had so much success against the Romans that you can understand why Khosrau didn't expect them to put up any sort of resistance at this point. But, you know, I guess the Romans managed to get it together a little bit.
Generals take the lead. The excited Roman generals pushed their advantage, but they pushed too far, handing an easy victory back to Iran that stabilized the war. Both sides sought peace at this point. An embassy from Tiberias was on its way to Iran for approval of the final terms, but before it even reached Ctesiphon, Khosrau died of old age.
Damn. And before we get to that, a quick note on seeking peace. This would not be the end of conflict between the Romans and the Sassanids. In fact, they would both get pretty close to destroying each other before the Sassanid Empire was completely ended by early Muslim expansion, which we did a series on that. The spread of Islam and the Caliphate would completely eat up the Sassanid Empire, and it would be no more. But before that, the Romans and the Sassanids would keep going back and forth. At one point, the Sassanids, almost destroyed the Roman Empire completely. I mean, they were doing a real number on it before a Roman emperor, Heraclius, managed to save Rome, and in fact campaign in Persia, doing a great deal of damage to it. So they would keep going back and forth to their mutual detriment, because when Islam emerged and Muhammad started campaigning, and then those who came after him, the Caliphate, started expanding, both Rome and Persia would be too weak to resist this Muslim expansion. Now, Rome would stop it at one point. Rome lost a lot of land to the Caliphate, but it would survive for many hundreds of years. The Sassanids were not so lucky. Their empire would completely disintegrate. So that's what is coming relatively soon after Khosrau's death for both of these giant empires. But back to Khosrau himself.
Khosrau had built upon the groundwork laid by his father to remake an empire and create an Iranian golden age.
Yeah.
But that golden age ended with him. His son rejected the peace terms
Yep, I mean, they're covering some of it right now.
with Rome and went back to war. He quarreled with the Arabic allies who had so long guarded Iran's southern border. The Turks saw this long-awaited opportunity and struck at his overextended armies.
Uh-oh.
In the end, even the court turned against Khosrau's son and overthrew him. In the decades that followed, the Sasanian dynasty struggled to maintain the vast army Khosrau had built. They struggled to support the centers of learning Khosrau had cherished.
And this is what I'm saying, once again, another parallel between Justinian and Khosrau. They were very similar in many ways. I think this is another example of that. Just like Justinian was overly ambitious, he stretched his resources too thin, and it would come back to bite the empire later. Seems like Khosrau was kind of similar. He achieved a lot of great things, but he might have taken it a step too far. He was overly ambitious. All of the things he established, these centers of learning, these institutions, this enlarged and expanded, territorially expanded military, the Sassanid Empire could not keep up after he was gone. I imagine this was probably damaging to the long-term prospects of the empire, but I think what was more damaging was we saw the quarreling with Arab allies, the attacks of the Turks from the east, and the continuing warfare with the Romans to the west. All of these things would really weaken the Sassanid Empire in the long term, probably combined with the plague. We didn't talk about the plague too much, but I imagine that also did a number on the empire.
And ultimately, they fell. Not to Rome, and not to Christianity, but to the Muslims, a new force that rose up from the south. And here, perhaps, Khosrau found his legacy. Because while his descendants had failed to keep the empire together, the Muslims studied his way of governing Iran and adopted it. They admired his university and brought its wisdom back with them to Baghdad. But that is a story for another day. Thanks for watching.
Wow. I mean, I knew there was a lot of Iranian influence on the Caliphate and the Muslim world as a whole. There was a lot of mixture between Arabic culture, Islam, Persian culture, all of this stuff was very important to the Caliphate and the Islamic world in general. And yeah, I guess it makes sense that Khosrau in particular would be an important figure to look back on. His emphasis on learning, his reforms, his revitalization of the military, his successes against the Romans. There's a lot of accomplishments to look back on and be proud of, and a lot of accomplishments to emulate, right? Even though a lot of what Khosrau created would crumble, and it would all crumble along with the fall of the Sassanid Empire, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to do what he did. So very fascinating. I enjoyed this series. Like I said, this is the last episode of this one. I might do part 6 Lies as a patron/channel member exclusive. Let me know if you're interested in that. I might just leave it. I don't know. But yeah, I really enjoyed learning about Khosrau. I enjoy stuff like this because Khosrau is a figure who I knew a little bit about. He's sort of on the peripheral of my expertise, or my knowledge. I know a bit about the Byzantines, about Justinian, and so I know a little bit about Khosrau. He's sort of at the edge of a lot of my other knowledge, and so I enjoy learning about him because I learned a ton of stuff that I did not know previously. A really fascinating character, fascinating history, but I was able to connect it back to information that I'm a little more comfortable with, a context which I'm more familiar with, aka the Roman Empire. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this series. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon and channel memberships, all of that good stuff. Now, with that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.